After a heart-wrenching breakup, Melissa decided it was time to let go of the past, including the exquisite ring her ex had given her. With a heavy heart, she walked into a renowned jeweler's shop, hoping to part with the ring and maybe get some money in return. As the jeweler took a closer look, his eyes widened in disbelief. The man, Mr. Harris, gasped as he looked back up at Melissa. "Wait here, I'll be right back," he said, as he disappeared into a back room, taking the ring with him. Melissa was left alone at the counter, and she was a bit confused by the jeweler's reaction. She had owned this ring for a couple of years now, and she never noticed anything very special about it. I mean, it was a beautiful ring for sure, but that was all there was to say about it. At least, that's what Melissa thought. She would soon find out the truth. She looked around the shop as she listened to the sounds coming from the back office, where Mr. Harris appeared to be rummaging through some drawers. She heard him muttering something, and she assumed that he was just talking to himself, but she couldn't understand what he was saying. "Is everything all right?" she asked him, wondering if she should have gone to a different shop instead. Mr. Harris replied, Yes, I'll be right there, just checking something." He was doing his best to hide the fact that he was stressed, but Melissa could clearly hear it in his voice. She sighed and stayed at the counter, waiting for him to return. She still had no idea of the shocking discovery she was about to make. This day was going to end a lot differently than she had thought it would. And not in a good way, let me tell you. Minutes later, she heard Mr. Harris say, "Aha, there it is." And soon after, she heard footsteps coming closer and closer until he finally reappeared on the doorstep again. She thought that she could sell him the ring now and go home, but nothing was further from the truth. He was holding something in his hands, a piece of paper. Melissa assumed that that was what he had been looking for, but she didn't understand what it had to do with her ring. She tried to get a better look at it, but Mr. Harris had folded the paper in half so she couldn't see what was on it and put it in his pocket. "Miss Melissa, I hope you don't mind, but I have to ask you a personal question," he told her. She nodded and he asked, "Where did you get this ring?" He looked her right in the eyes, and he had a very serious look on his face, almost strict even. Melissa blushed, but she didn't know if that was because of the memory of her ex or the accusing tone in Mr. Harris's voice. "My ex-boyfriend gave it to me a few years ago," she replied. She explained that they weren't together anymore, and she thought it was time to get rid of this ring. "Very well, I see," Mr. Harris replied, as he scratched his head. "Do you happen to know where he got this ring?" he asked, carefully formulating his question. Melissa shook her head and told him she had always assumed he had bought it at a jewelry store. She never thought to ask him where he had bought her present. That would be very odd, she thought to herself. "Well, I actually need to discuss this with a colleague before I can buy it from you. They are on their way here right now. It shouldn't take long until they get here. Would you like a cup of coffee or tea while you wait?" Melissa was a little bit caught off guard because of this, but she replied, Yeah, sure. Why not?" She thought it probably wasn't that weird for jewelers to ask for a second opinion in these situations, and she thought he surely wouldn't do that if he didn't think the ring was worth a lot of money. She became excited at this thought, and suddenly she didn't mind staying a bit longer in the shop at all. She enjoyed her tea while dreaming about ways to spend the money, thinking that she was waiting for Mr. Harris's colleague. However, she had no idea that it was not a colleague he had called. In the following 10 minutes, not much happened. It was like the calm before the storm. A couple of other people came into the shop and looked around or even bought something before leaving again. There was not one sign of the chaos that was about to ensue. Melissa was lost in thought when she heard the bell ring again, signaling that another customer had entered the shop. She didn't look up to see who had walked in this time, and that was why she hadn't seen that it was a police officer. Suddenly, she heard Mr. Harris say, "Thank you so much for coming right away. That's her, right there," as he pointed to Melissa. She was surprised and she didn't understand what was happening for a moment, and then she finally noticed the man in the police suit, the officer, walked over to her and said, "Ma'am, I'm afraid you have to come to the station with me." Melissa couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What? Me? Why? I haven't done anything," she exclaimed. However, the officer wouldn't listen to her, and he was very insistent. "Please, follow me to the car," he said. Melissa scoffed. She didn't even know what this was about. "At least tell me why. What do you think I've done? I have never been arrested for anything before in my life," she exclaimed, thinking this all had to be a huge mistake. Spoiler, it wasn't. Well, not in the way you would think. "Ma'am, you can cooperate, or I will have to force you to come with me," he said. Melissa realized that this man was being serious, and she decided just to do what he said. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, and if she explained it to them at the station, they would have to believe her. "And for clarification, I am not arresting you. Yet. I am just taking you to the station to ask you some questions. If you can prove you haven't done anything wrong, we will let you go. But you're going to have to convince us all if you want that to happen." Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she followed the cop to his car and took a place in the back seat. She felt so embarrassed. People had been looking at her outside, and they probably thought she was a thief. She wiped her tears and tried to calm herself down, but that was difficult, seeing as she had no idea what was going on. The officer suddenly said, "We're here," and he turned off the car engine. Melissa looked out of the window, and she saw that they had arrived at the police station. The officer got out of the car and opened the door for her, and he said, "Follow me." Melissa did as he asked, and he led her to an interrogation room at the back of a dark hallway. "Wait here," he said, and he closed the door, leaving her alone and stuck in this room. He was not a man of many words. That much was obvious now. She looked around the room, feeling nervous and not knowing what to expect. She followed the rules and the law, and she had never even gotten so much as a parking ticket. She couldn't think of anything she had done that she needed to be interrogated for, and yet, here she was. However, she didn't have much time to think. The door opened again, and the same officer from before entered. This time, he had brought a colleague. The man said, "Hi, Melissa. I am Officer Davis. I see you've already met my colleague, Officer Johnson. Now, I want you to tell us about that ring." Of course, Officer Davis had no idea that his colleague had never properly introduced himself to Melissa. But that isn't important right now. What really shook Melissa was the last thing the officer said, mentioning the ring. "So that's what this is all about," she thought. "The ring?" Melissa asked, full of disbelief. "What about the ring? I told Mr. Harris everything already," she said. "Well, we want you to tell it again, but this time, to us." "Where did you get it?" Officer Davis asked. This all made no sense to Melissa. What could be so special about that stupid ring that the police needed to interrogate her about it? "Well, my ex-boyfriend gave it to me, right before he cheated on me with my best friend. I still haven't forgiven either of them for it, and to be honest, I don't think I ever will. All right, we get it. Cut to the chase now, will you?" One of the officers interrupted her. "When did he give it to you? Do you know where he bought it?" he asked Melissa. She said, "No, I have no idea. He never told me, and I never cared enough to ask. Can someone please tell me what is going on? I don't even want that stupid ring anymore." Officer Davis took a deep breath, glancing at Officer Johnson before turning his attention back to Melissa. "We understand this is confusing, and we owe you an explanation," he began. "The ring you possess isn't just any ordinary piece of jewelry." Melissa leaned forward, her anxiety evident. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her eyes darting between the two officers. Officer Johnson took over. "That ring, Melissa, is an artifact with deep historical roots. It's not just valuable because of the gems or the metal, but because of its history." Melissa's eyes widened in surprise. "It's been passed down through generations, representing a lineage of power and wealth. Its monetary value is immense, but its historical significance is even greater." Davis interjected, "The reason we're involved is that this ring was reported stolen from the Metropolitan Museum 2 years ago. It was part of a temporary exhibit showcasing royal artifacts." Melissa's heart raced. "Stolen? But how did it end up with me?" she stammered. The officers exchanged a glance, realizing the depth of the situation. "Mr. Harris, the jeweler you visited, has a keen interest in historical artifacts," Officer Johnson explained. "He remembered reading about the theft in a trade magazine. When you presented the ring to him, he recognized it immediately." Melissa felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. "So, he called you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Officer Davis nodded. "Yes, but let me be clear. We don't believe you had any part in the theft. Your reactions, your genuine confusion, it all points to your innocence." He paused, letting the words sink in. "However, we need to find out how this ring ended up in your possession. It's crucial to solve this mystery and bring the real culprits to justice." Melissa nodded, determined to help in any way she could. As the officers continued explaining the ring's significance, a memory flashed in Melissa's mind. She remembered Steve's odd reaction when she'd once asked about the ring's origin, his evasiveness, the way he'd quickly changed the subject. It all began to make sense. Could Steve be involved? She wondered aloud, her voice tinged with disbelief. Melissa hesitated, then began recounting certain incidents. There were times when Steve would disappear without explanation. He had a small collection of antiques, always vague about their origins. She recalled a particular evening when he'd come home, a triumphant gleam in his eyes, clutching a small box, the same box that held the ring. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Gathering her courage, Melissa looked the officers in the eyes. I think Steve knows more than he ever let on. He might be our only lead to uncover the truth behind the ring's journey. The officers exchanged glances, realizing the gravity of her statement. If Steve is involved, we need to approach this carefully, Officer Davis murmured. The room was thick with tension as they began to strategize. We need a confession, something concrete, Officer Johnson stated. What if we set up a meeting? Wire Melissa, get her to talk to Steve, and see if he spills anything. Officer Davis pondered the idea, weighing the risks. It's dangerous, but it might be our best shot. Melissa felt a whirlwind of emotions. The thought of facing Steve, especially under these circumstances, was daunting. But she knew the importance of the situation. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. I'll do it, she said, determination evident in her voice. But we need to ensure everything goes smoothly. The officers nodded in agreement, appreciating her bravery. Officer Davis cleared his throat, his face grave. Melissa, you need to understand the risks involved. If Steve is indeed connected to the theft, he might become defensive or even aggressive. Melissa swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the situation. We'll be monitoring every second, ready to intervene, Officer Johnson added, trying to offer some reassurance. But you'll be walking a tightrope. In a dimly lit room, Melissa was introduced to a range of surveillance equipment. A technician carefully fitted her with a concealed microphone and an earpiece, ensuring they were discreet yet functional. You'll be able to hear us, and we'll hear everything you and Steve discuss, the technician explained. Melissa nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. Officer Davis played the role of Steve as they practiced potential conversation scenarios. Remember, stay calm and stick to the script. Try to steer the conversation towards the ring, he advised. Melissa repeated her lines, trying to sound as natural as possible. They went over various responses, preparing her for different outcomes. Alone for a moment, Melissa's mind raced. Memories of her time with Steve flooded back. The good times, the heartbreak, the betrayal. She felt a pang of sadness, anger, and apprehension. Can I really do this? She wondered. Taking deep breaths, she tried to center herself, reminding herself of the importance of her mission. The officers gathered around Melissa, maps and communication devices spread out on the table. We'll have officers stationed outside and inside the venue. At the first sign of trouble, we'll move in, Officer Johnson detailed. Officer Davis added, trust your instincts, Melissa, and remember, we've got your back. Melissa nodded, taking one last deep breath as she prepared to face her past. With trembling fingers, Melissa typed out a message to Steve. Hey, it's been a while. Fancy catching up over a drink? She hesitated for a moment before hitting send. The weight of the situation pressed on her, but she knew she had to move forward. The message was out, and the ball was now in Steve's court. It didn't take long. Almost immediately, her phone buzzed with a new message. Mel, I've been thinking about you. Would love to catch up. When and where? Melissa could sense Steve's enthusiasm, even through the text. It was clear he was eager, maybe even hopeful, about their reunion. Melissa pondered for a moment. She needed somewhere familiar, somewhere they'd shared memories. How about O'Malley's? 8 p.m., she typed. The bar held significance for them. It was where they celebrated anniversaries and shared countless dates. It would be the perfect setting to make Steve feel at ease. As the hours ticked by, Melissa's anxiety grew. She practiced her lines, went over the plan, and tried to anticipate Steve's reactions. She changed her outfit multiple times, aiming for the perfect balance of casual and put together. Every time she thought of the impending confrontation, her heart raced. She had to stay calm and focused. Unbeknownst to the regular patrons, O'Malley's had some additional visitors that evening. Officers Davis and Johnson, along with a few undercover colleagues, discreetly took positions around the bar. They had a clear view of Melissa's table and ensured all exits were covered. They were ready, waiting for the scene to unfold. The dim lighting of O'Malley's cast a nostalgic glow as Melissa spotted Steve at the bar. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of the situation faded. They hugged, and Steve's familiar scent brought back a flood of memories. "It's been too long," Steve remarked, his voice tinged with genuine warmth. Melissa smiled, her heart pounding not from affection, but from the gravity of her mission. "It really has," she replied, her voice steady. They chatted about work, friends, and the latest movies, with Melissa laughing at his jokes and sharing stories, all the while playing the part of the interested ex-girlfriend. In their covert positions, Officers Davis and Johnson listened to every word exchanged between the pair. The earpiece relayed the conversation with crystal clarity. They exchanged glances, waiting for the conversation to shift to the topic they were most interested in. Every word, every pause, was analyzed for significance. As the evening wore on, Melissa began to artfully steer the conversation. "Remember the gifts we used to give each other? Like that beautiful ring you gave me," she said, her voice casual. Steve's eyes flickered briefly, but he responded, "Ah, yes, that was a special one." Melissa probed further. "Where did you find such a unique piece?" The ambiance of the bar, the familiarity of their banter, and perhaps the drinks had Steve feeling more relaxed. He leaned in closer, a hint of the old intimacy returning. "It's a long story," he began, his guard lowering. Melissa's heart raced, knowing she was on the brink of uncovering the truth. The atmosphere grew tense as Melissa took a deep breath, mustering the courage for her next question. "Steve," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "I've always wondered, where did you really get that ring?" She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception. Steve's face went pale, and he took a moment, clearly caught off guard. He looked down at his drink, swirling the liquid, buying himself time. "Melissa," he began, his voice shaky. "It's not as simple as just buying it from a store." He seemed to be wrestling with himself, torn between revealing the truth and keeping his secret. Taking a deep breath, Steve finally spoke. "I didn't buy it. I took it." His eyes met Melissa's, filled with a mix of regret and desperation. "It was a mistake, a moment of madness. I thought it would impress you, show you how much I cared." He looked down, waiting for her reaction. But before Melissa could respond, the calm ambiance of the bar was shattered. The doors burst open with a loud bang, causing other patrons to turn in shock. Shadows of multiple figures loomed at the entrance, their intentions clear. Officers, with badges gleaming, swiftly moved through the bar. In mere seconds, they surrounded Steve, who looked up in sheer disbelief. "Steve Thompson, you're under arrest," Officer Davis declared, handcuffing him. The bar was filled with murmurs and gasps as Steve, still in shock, was led away, realizing the gravity of his confession. The bar's atmosphere grew thick with tension. Steve's face turned a shade paler, his eyes widening in disbelief. "That wasn't a confession. I was just talking," he stammered, his voice quivering. Desperation was evident in his eyes as he looked around, seeking an ally, a way out. "You can't just arrest me based on a conversation," he exclaimed, his voice echoing in the now silent bar. Officer Johnson, with a stern expression, produced a small playback device. "Your words, Steve," he said, pressing play. The room filled with Steve's voice, detailing the theft of the ring. Alongside the recording, photographs of the stolen ring matched with museum documentation were laid out. The undeniable evidence painted a clear picture, leaving Steve cornered and overwhelmed. The weight of his actions bore down on Steve. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging. Okay, he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I did it. I took the ring, thinking it would change everything for us." He looked up at Melissa, seeking understanding, but was met with a gaze of disappointment and hurt. Melissa stood at a distance, her heart heavy. A storm of emotions raged within her. Relief that the truth had surfaced, anger at Steve's audacity, and a deep-seated sadness for the love they once cherished. She had yearned for closure, but the unfolding events brought a complexity of feelings she hadn't anticipated. The flashing lights of the police car cast a blue hue on the bar's exterior. Officers guided Steve, now handcuffed, towards the vehicle. As the car's door closed, sealing Steve's fate, Melissa watched from the bar's entrance. The sight of him, once her love, now a criminal, being taken away, was a poignant reminder of the unpredictable turns life could take. Inside the stark, cold interrogation room at the police station, Steve sat across from Officers Davis and Johnson. The overhead light cast a harsh glow, emphasizing the lines of stress on his face. "It was years ago," he began, his voice shaky. "I thought the ring would be my ticket to a better life." He detailed the planning, the execution, and the aftermath of the theft. The room seemed to blur as Steve's story transported them back in time. The museum, grand and imposing, was silent in the dead of night. Steve, equipped with tools and driven by desperation, had bypassed security systems with surprising skill. He remembered the thrill of holding the ring, a symbol of centuries of history, in his hand before making his escape. Back in the present, Steve's eyes glistened with tears. "I never imagined the weight this ring would carry," he admitted, his voice choked with emotion. "It wasn't just about the money or impressing Melissa. It became a chain, a constant reminder of the wrong I'd done." He looked down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his actions and their repercussions. Melissa, in another room, recounted her side of the story. She spoke of the gift, her ignorance of its true origin, and the eventual realization of Steve's crime. "I never suspected," she said, her voice firm yet tinged with sadness. Her statement, combined with the evidence, would be instrumental in ensuring Steve faced the consequences of his actions. After the whirlwind of events, Melissa found herself back at the jewelry store. Mr. Harris, the jeweler who had recognized the stolen ring, greeted her with a warm smile. "I've been in this business for decades," he said, "and that ring story was well known in our circles. Thank you, Melissa, for playing a pivotal role in bringing closure to this long-standing mystery." The grand hall of the museum was abuzz with activity. Museum officials, along with a small crowd, gathered to express their gratitude. The museum's director approached Melissa, extending a warm handshake. "Your actions have helped recover a piece of history," he said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. Beside him, Officers Davis and Johnson nodded in agreement, proud of the successful resolution. The director went on to explain the ring's significance. "This ring dates back centuries, belonging to a renowned monarch. It symbolizes a pivotal treaty that ended decades of conflict." As he spoke, Melissa realized the gravity of Steve's theft. The ring wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It held a deep historical and cultural significance. News of the ring's recovery spread like wildfire. Local newspapers and TV stations clamored for interviews with Melissa, the woman at the center of the story. Headlines praised her bravery and integrity. "Local heroine assists in recovering stolen artifact," one headline read. Melissa, though overwhelmed, felt a sense of pride in her role in the unfolding drama. The courtroom was packed as Steve's trial concluded. The evidence against him, especially his confession, was irrefutable. The judge, after hearing all testimonies, delivered the verdict. Steve was found guilty of theft and sentenced to several years in prison. As he was led away, a sense of finality settled over the room. With the ring returned to its rightful place and Steve facing the consequences of his actions, the town felt a collective sense of relief and closure. The museum saw an influx of visitors, eager to view the now famous artifact. The story served as a reminder of the importance of preserving history and the community's role in upholding justice. The media frenzy had subsided, and the town's chatter about the ring theft began to wane. Melissa, however, found it challenging to return to her everyday life. Everywhere she went, she was recognized as the woman tied to the museum heist. Coffee runs and grocery shopping became a series of nods and whispers. "Isn't that the girl whose ex-boyfriend stole the museum ring?" they'd say. Quiet moments at home gave Melissa time to reflect. The entire ordeal had been a crash course in trust and intuition. She realized that ignoring red flags, especially in relationships, could lead to unforeseen consequences. "Trust your gut," she'd often tell herself, thinking back to the times she'd felt something was off with Steve but had brushed it aside. Determined not to let the past define her, Melissa made a conscious decision to move forward. She began attending therapy, where she processed her feelings about Steve's betrayal and the media's attention. Slowly, she rebuilt her life, focusing on her own well-being and happiness, leaving the shadows of the past behind. Embracing her newfound freedom, Melissa took up activities she'd always wanted to try. She joined a dance class, traveled solo to places she'd dreamt of, and even started a small online business. Her single life became an adventure, filled with new experiences and discoveries. Each day was a step away from the drama and a stride towards self-discovery. As days turned into months, Melissa's optimism grew. She had weathered a storm and emerged stronger. The ring, the theft, and Steve became chapters in her past, lessons that shaped her but didn't define her. Looking ahead, she felt a surge of excitement. The future was a blank canvas, and she held the brush, ready to paint her brighter tomorrow.